Chapter 16. In a tight corner. I was caught red-handed, caught as neatly as any bona fide burglar who ever picked a lock. I had opened the trunk of a fellow visitor with a skeleton key. I had been caught in the very act of pilfering the contents. Indeed, at that very moment I held in my left hand a tiny leather box containing Engström's diamond tie-pin and studs, while with my right hand I had been delving into his big trunk. Never was a capture neater or more complete. And, with the menace of the big revolver in Engström's hand, and knowing something of my captor, I knew better than to attempt a rush for escape. I should never have reached the door alive. "Well, and what does this mean?" harshly demanded the Swedish engineer, in bad French, still covering me with his pistol. "And who are you?" Had Engström suspected who I really was, I knew he would have shot me out of hand and chanced all consequences. Indeed, he would have had little to fear, for there would have been nothing more than a casual inquiry into the shooting of a thief caught red-handed. Moreover, dead men tell no tales, and Engström would have had no difficulty whatever in excusing himself by some hastily concocted story that I had attacked him as soon as he found me plundering his trunk. My disguise saved me, and it was evident he had no suspicion that I was anything but a common thief. I broke instantly into a torrent of excuses, putting down the little jewel box and the papers with as guilty an air as I could assume. The situation obviously required both tact and cunning, for I realized that I was in a tight corner and that a slip would cost me my life. I pleaded desperate poverty. I was an honest workman driven to evil courses by want. I am afraid I even invented a story of a wholly mythical wife and family in the last stage of starvation. Finally, I roundly promised amendment of my ways if he would but let me go. "Forgive me this time," I implored. "Do forgive me. This will ruin me." "You dog of a thief, I have caught you stealing from my room," was his only reply. "I shall call the manager," and he slammed the door and pressed the electric bell. "Send the manager here at once," he commanded the messenger who answered the bell. Luigi came immediately, and there was a great scene in which my friend very cleverly worked himself into a state of virtuous indignation at the slur I had cast upon his hotel's high reputation. He assured Engström that justice should be done forthwith, and actually handed me over to a police officer, and I was at once marched off as a common hotel thief. Guess my surprise when, as soon as we had turned the first corner, the officer whispered, "Monsieur Battini has told me all the circumstances. He did not telephone to the bureau, but called me in out of the street. Dash away from me in a few moments when we come to a lonely place, and I will merely pretend to follow you. But, monsieur, get away from Lucerne as quickly as possible." I smiled. Luigi had shown that he possessed a quick and ready resourcefulness. It was most fortunate that Engström, finding me with my skeleton keys on the floor and his jewelry in my hand, had failed to suspect the truth. I slipped away at the first convenient corner, and an hour later was well on my way by the Sant Gotthard route to Milan, the excellent police officer undertaking to let Luigi know whither I had gone. I learned later that, when my escape was reported to him, Engström took the matter very quietly, and, beyond roundly abusing the officer for letting me slip through his fingers, did not propose any further action. As a matter of fact, having lost nothing, he was probably well content that the affair should end thus. I have no doubt that, masquerading in the name of another man, publicity was the last thing he would desire. Our problem now was how to deal with Engström and his associates. Obviously, to arrest them, even if we had good ground for doing so, would have been to defeat our own object, for we wanted to find out all the details of the plot upon which they were engaged. But, as a matter of fact, they had done nothing up to this moment to bring themselves within the clutches of the law. Engström, it is true, was posing as someone else, but, so long as he did not attempt to profit by it, this was not a criminal offense. I decided to continue our investigations. Reaching Milan, I put up at the Cavour, where, of course, I was well known. A few hours later, I received a long dispatch in cipher from Madame Gabrielle, and 2 days later an explicit letter from Luigi. I was also able to secure some further information regarding the mysterious engineer and his friends, and this decided me to go to Sweden myself and see the real Mr. Engström. My journey to Malmö was uneventful, and, arriving there, I lost no time in repairing to the yard of Messrs. Engström and Linner, the engineers. There, in the private office of the head of the firm, I soon found myself face to face with the principal, Mr. Oscar Engström. He was a short, dark, alert little man, with charming manners, and I took a liking to him at once. I had not previously decided on my course of action, but after a few minutes' conversation, I decided on a policy of complete frankness. As rapidly as possible, I told him the full story of the man who had been using his name in London and on the continent. At first, he expressed himself as completely puzzled. He could not, he said, imagine what the object of the gang could be. They could hardly commit the firm to anything which would profit themselves, for no one abroad would act without inquiries. At length I happened to mention that Johnson Meads had told me that the man had for disposal something connected with submarines. "With submarines?" he exclaimed in obvious surprise. "Why, we have in hand at this moment several submarine inventions of which we own the patents. Two of them are completely secret, and they are in use only by France and Britain." This put a new aspect on the affair. "I begin to see now," I said, "why your name has been assumed. Have you heard of any attempt to secure the submarine secrets?" "None whatever," replied Mr. Engström. "Moreover, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. One of the appliances with which we are concerned is of such importance that, while we make the greater part of it, a vital portion is manufactured in England, and the apparatus is not put together until the whole is actually on the submarine for which it is intended. Consequently, unless a thief or spy secured copies of the plans both here and in England, he would be powerless to profit by either. I may mention that this arrangement was arrived at with the British Admiralty at our express wish and suggestion. I am quite frank with you, Mr. Sant. One more question, Mr. Engström," I added. "You are in a position to know of any important inventions in connection with submarine work. Have you heard of any recent invention which would bring it within the bounds of possibility that your double is acting honestly and has really something to sell?" "That is out of the question," returned the engineer decidedly. "Unless the invention were German, in which case it would not come out of that country. I think I should certainly have heard something of it. Of course, we have rivals in our business, but there is a certain amount of freemasonry even among business rivals. I know all the people who are making submarine parts. There are very few who could or would tackle a big invention. Besides, if the man has an honest bargain to drive, why should he assume my name?" This argument was unanswerable, but I confess I was still a long way from guessing just what the bogus Engström and his friends were plotting. My next visit was to the Swedish police in search of information about Madame Bowman. Here, however, I was quite at fault. It was evident she was passing under an assumed name, and I could not succeed in identifying her among the long array of photographs of known German agents laid before me by the chief of the Swedish secret police. Arriving at Bergen, I received, before I sailed for England, a long telegram from Madame Gabrielle telling me that Engström, Madame Bowman, and Thornton had left for Paris. Fearing that they would immediately recognize her if she followed them, she had telephoned the news to Heck, and that astute official had promised to take the suspects under his own wing for the immediate future, pending my arrival. I proceeded to London, where, to my dismay, I learned that although Madame Bowman had arrived in Paris with Thornton, Engström was missing. 20 minutes later, I was speaking with Heck at Saint-Germain over the official telephone. 3 days later, I heard that Heck's men had succeeded in running the elusive Engström to earth at Marseille, where he was staying at the Hôtel Louvre et Paix under the name of Janssen, and was constantly meeting a compatriot named Tegelmund. The situation at this moment remained a complete puzzle so far as the real objective of the gang was concerned. On the one hand, we had at Marseille the mysterious individual who posed as the Swedish engineer, Engström. On the other, we had his known associates, Thornton and Madame Bowman, in Paris. Engström was living quite openly, with no appearance of concealment, at a good hotel, but he was quite obviously doing nothing and meeting nobody. The other two, however, were just as obviously lying low. They had taken apartments at a very small and not very reputable hotel in the Rue Royale, and both had changed their names, entering France with new and apparently perfectly genuine Swedish passports issued only a few weeks previously. Our next discovery was a staggering surprise. One of our agents, who had been watching Madame Beauman, came in and reported that, late the previous night, she had left her hotel and walked swiftly to an obscure café in the Quartier Latin. She had entered the place, taken a seat at a table by herself, and called for a glass of wine. While she was drinking it, a man, very untidy and apparently half intoxicated, lurched up to the table and sat down facing her. She took no notice of him whatever, or he of her. Calling a waiter, the man ordered a double glass of Chianti. Our agent, seated at an adjoining table, saw her then glance quickly at the stranger, and a moment later she ordered an absinthe. Now, an order for a double glass of Chianti is unusual, especially in a disreputable café in a low part of Paris, and it is hardly customary for women to follow wine with absinthe. Our agent was struck by the oddity of the two orders and listened closely. Directly the waiter had placed the drinks on the table and left, the man, without even glancing at the woman, muttered something in an undertone which our agent could not catch. It was, however, evidently sufficient, for the woman drank up her absinthe and, rising, left the café. She took no notice whatever of the man, and he paid, to all appearances, as little regard to her. Apparently half overcome by drink, he remained at the table, nodding drowsily, for a quarter of an hour. It was a clever bit of acting, but he forgot his eyes. Our agent caught a sight of them and realized at once that the drunkenness was feigned. At length, the man got up and lurched towards the door. The police agent at the same moment left by another exit into an adjoining street and, casually turning the corner in the direction the supposed drunken man had taken, saw him a few yards ahead, walking steadily enough. 5 minutes later, he had overtaken Madame Beauman, and walking side by side for a few hundred yards, they had a brief conversation and parted. Our agent was in a quandary. He had the strictest instructions not to lose sight of Madame Beauman, but he was a man of intelligence and realized that a new factor had appeared on the scene. Accordingly, he decided to follow the man, and soon saw him enter a cheap boarding house, letting himself in with a latchkey. 5 minutes later we had the news, and a couple of men were at once detailed to take up the watch. Madame Beauman, we soon ascertained, had gone straight to her hotel. The boarding house which the mysterious stranger had entered was closely watched all night. The next morning the man came out and was immediately recognized as none other than Halbmayer himself. How he had got into France and Paris was a mystery, for the police had no register of his arrival. I may say here that this point was never completely cleared up, but it was very generally believed that he was put ashore by a submarine and intended leaving in the same way. We now had him safely enough. He could not possibly escape. He was a known spy, and there was ample ground for arresting him. But this would have made mincemeat of our plans, as Heck saw plainly enough. "Halbmayer is very dangerous," he declared to me as I sat in his office the same day. "Evil work is on foot somewhere, and our friend the German is director of operations. He would not dare to show his face in France after meeting Brahe in Lisbon unless he were playing for a big coup. But, my dear Sant, what is his motive? What is he after? To that question, so far, we have got no reply whatever, and we must find the answer." I agreed with my chief most cordially. "Give him rope," I said, "and see if he does not hang himself. At any rate, he won't escape us this time. We shall get him even if we don't learn his secret. What worries me is that he may have done his nefarious work and inflicted untold injury on the Allies before we nab him. But we must take some chances." The telegram sent by Brahe, or Thornton, to Engström just before the former left Lisbon mentioned two things, said my chief. The first was that Johnson Meads was with them. In other words, that his suspicions had been allayed, which we know to be a fact, and that T was here in Paris to arrange further details and transit of machinery. What machinery? And who is T? T must be Tegelmund, the man in Marseille. We must look out for him. Chapter 17. The plot revealed. Within a week, the man Tegelmund, accompanied by Engström, arrived in Paris and took up his abode in an obscure hotel near the Gare du Nord. But though we kept a careful watch upon the pair, Engström, ever elusive and resourceful, suddenly disappeared. For 6 days he was absent. Then, as suddenly and mysteriously, he appeared again at the hotel. Aubert, who had been detailed to watch Tegelmund, now reported that the latter had been across to the Orléans goods station, inquiring about some heavy cases of goods which had arrived from Lisbon. "I have contrived to open one of the cases," he said. "It contains some complicated and apparently delicate machinery, with a small dynamo. Apparently it is some sort of wireless plant, but beyond that, I cannot make head or tail of it." At Aubert's suggestion, I went late one night to the Orléans goods yard. Aubert, by methods of persuasion not wholly original, had contrived to make friends with one of the officials, and we had no difficulty in securing access to the great goods shed, now silent and deserted, in which the mysterious cases lay. Prizing open one end of the topmost case, I inspected the contents as closely as I could with the aid of my pocket flashlamp. Within was what certainly appeared to be a wireless plant of some kind, but it was of a description entirely new to me, and I could not see enough of it to gain any idea of its purpose. Of course, we dared not risk unpacking it. But we had made a great advance. The big cases could not be secretly moved, and our friend, the goods official, undertook to let us know promptly when he received orders to release them. We waited in patience for a week, but still the cases remained untouched and uncalled for. Then came an incident which threw a flood of light on the proceedings of our enemies, though it told us nothing of their real motive. We were to learn that later. One day I was strolling aimlessly along the Boulevard des Capucines when I heard my name pronounced in accents of delighted surprise. Turning round, I instantly recognized an old friend in the person of Captain A-, who was one of the experts attached to the submarine branch of the British Admiralty. "My dear Sant," he exclaimed joyfully, "who would have thought of meeting you here? I am alone in Paris. I know no one and am bored to death. What have you got on hand now? I thought you were in New York." "I certainly didn't expect to meet you here," I replied. "What has brought you over?" "Come and have some lunch, and I'll tell you all about it," he replied, and we repaired to an adjoining café, where Captain A promptly ordered lunch in a private room. "We've got a new thing on hand in the submarine line," he told me, as soon as the waiter had left the room. "You know we have been trying some experiments in German waters lately, and the Hun destroyers have been so confoundedly active that our fellows have had to pass a lot of their time sitting on the bottom. As a consequence, some of the crew have suffered terribly for want of fresh air. We have a very good system of purifying the atmosphere, but it is not sufficient owing to the long periods the boats have to stay under water, and a number of men have collapsed and died from suffocation. Indeed, one boat only escaped with more than half her crew totally incapacitated." I was keenly on the alert. Was I wondered, coming to grips at last with our problem? "Well," Captain A went on, "we have been offered a new apparatus, which, if half of what the inventor tells us is true, will enable us to give the Hun a very bad time. We are assured that by its help a boat can stay under water for 5 days without the slightest risk." "5 days," I repeated incredulously. "Why, it's impossible." "So I thought," he rejoined. "But when Engström and Linner vouch for anything, you've got to listen." "Engström and Linner," I gasped. Things were getting warm indeed. "Yes," he replied. "Mr. Engström is in Paris now with his invention, and we are going to test it off Havre." Then I sprang my mine. "Would you be surprised to learn," I asked, as coolly as I could, "that your Mr. Engström is not Mr. Engström at all, but a German agent passing under his name? I have seen a good many badly surprised men in my life, but I never witnessed before or since such a spectacle of hopeless astonishment as Captain A presented when he grasped the full significance of this announcement. He sat staring at me, his mouth wide open, and with dismay written legibly on every line of his countenance. "But, Sant," he gasped, "are you sure?" Mr. Engström came to us in London and told us all about it. He explained that the inventor was a Spaniard who would not trust the neutrality of the Spanish government in the matter, and that he had brought his invention to Engström's with the idea of getting the best terms from one of the allies. "I have no doubt that the man posing as Engström came to you," I replied, "but nonetheless, he is not Engström at all." "Then what is his game?" countered A. "He has offered us the fullest test before we adopt his machine, and has not asked for a cent." "That remains to be seen," I answered, "but it bodes no good to the Allies. What does he propose?" "He has offered to install the apparatus on one of our newest types," replied A, "and she is on her way to Havre for the purpose. We are to make any test we like, and in fact, I am here to see the test carried out. The only condition he makes is that his machinery shall be sealed and not opened until after the test has proved it to be satisfactory." I began to see light. "Did he propose to go with you?" I asked. "No," replied A, rather ruefully, I fancied. "He said the machinery was so perfect that it would practically run itself from our electric accumulators, and that he would give us an absolutely free hand with it." "I wonder how many of you would have come back," I said meaningly. Swore fervently, and I saw by the gleam in his eyes that he was fully awake to the possibilities of the trap into which he had been so nearly led. Our task now, barring some unforeseeable contingency, was fairly easy. There was a good prospect of ensnaring our foes in the pit they had so skillfully dug for us. "The matter is up to you now," I told Adash. "I'm going to drop out till the very last minute, but I shall be with you then. It is of the utmost importance that we shall do nothing to scare these very wary birds. What is your plan?" "Well," said A, "it seems to me I had better go ahead as if nothing had happened. The arrangement is that Engström shall take his apparatus to Havre and install it on a 77. We are then to put to sea for the tests, and are to meet him later and inform him of our decision." "That will do all right," I said. "I shall come on board the submarine before Engström arrives, and then I think we shall surprise him." Departed at once to make the final arrangements, and I busied myself in sending off some telegrams, arranging for the final downfall of the Hun plotters. A week later, I found myself on board E-77 at Havre. The mysterious cases had been sent on, and with them came Engström, with Thornton and Tegelmund, who professed to be interested in the venture, the former financially, the latter as the inventor. Tegelmund was in high glee at being thus afforded an opportunity of putting his device to a thoroughly satisfactory test. We also had a big surprise in the arrival of Halbmeier, who arrived in Havre under the name of Meunier. That he should have ventured on the scene at all showed how intensely interested he was. Engström declared that the fitting of the machinery would occupy fully 3 days, and we, of course, humoured him in every way possible. A made himself particularly agreeable, playing the part of host to perfection, and it was evident that the conspirators never even dreamed that their nefarious designs were suspected by the genial naval officer who showed such an enthusiastic interest in the wonderful stories with which they plied him on the merits of their great discovery. The 3 days went by. 4 great cases of machinery had been duly shipped on board, and Engström, Thornton, and Tegelmund spent many hours daily at their work in the interior of the submarine. Of course I could not appear. I should have been recognized at once. But among the crew of the submarine were a couple of the smartest men of the Sûreté, who kept the bogus engineer and his associates under the closest scrutiny. They reported to me that Engström appeared to be the only one of the 3 with any great amount of mechanical knowledge, and that, while Tegelmund worked assiduously at his machine, the others spent most of their time carefully examining the details of the British vessel, in which they showed the greatest interest. I began to get at last an inkling of the plot. The 4th day dawned, the day of the denouement. Early in the morning I slipped on board the submarine, and when the 2 conspirators arrived, we made our coup. Engström, when he came on board with Tegelmund, found himself suddenly confronted by the commander with a stalwart bluejacket standing on either side of him. He was curtly informed that he could not go below. "But you promised," he shrieked, livid with vexation. "True," said the commander, "but you call yourself Oscar Engström of Malmö, and I happen to have the real Mr. Engström here." The engineer went white to the very lips as Mr. Engström, who had come post-haste from Stockholm in response to my urgent cable, emerged from behind the conning tower, closely followed by myself. The false Engström began a vehement protest, but ceased suddenly, for glancing round, he saw Tegelmund also under guard. The game was up. A few minutes later, with Engström and Tegelmund safely in irons, the Admiralty experts who had come over from London began a minute examination of the wonderful invention. They soon discovered that the cases contained a jumble of wires and odds and ends of mechanical scraps simply thrown together to look complicated and of no value whatever for the renewal of vitiated air. The real object was only revealed when we had got to the very heart of the amazing collection of rubbish. There, cunningly hidden among much that was superfluous, was a highly efficient electric motor, wonderfully made and controlling a powerful bomb by machinery, set to detonate the explosive after 6 hours running. The machinery was to have been operated by the electric batteries of the submarine, and had the E-77 gone to sea and begun the tests of the bogus apparatus, not a vestige of the vessel or the crew would have been seen again, and the secret of her loss would have been locked forever in the depths of the Atlantic. But this, we found, was only a part of the plot, perhaps even the least important part. Tegelmund, finding himself trapped, turned craven and revealed the whole story. The real object of the spies was to get the fullest possible details of the internal arrangements of a British submarine of the latest type, and how well they had succeeded was shown when we cast our net a little wider. Directly Engström and Tegelmund were in custody, an innocent-looking signal flag flew from the masthead of the submarine, and the officials of the Sûreté ashore made their pounce. Thornton and Halbmeier were seized at once at their hotel, and in their possession we found a wonderful series of drawings in which many of the secrets of the submarine were fully explained. A telegram to Paris brought about also the arrest of Madame Baumann, and a few days later the German agents were safely immured in the convict prison at Tours, where they were sent by the sentence of a court-martial summoned immediately to deal with their case. Their guilt in this particular case was too clear for any possibility of denial, but I am glad to say that their arrest opened up a way to us to deal the Hun Secret Service a blow from which it has never fully recovered. Enormous piles of documents were seized and carefully examined, with the result that numerous associates of Thornton in England found themselves in durance vile for the duration, and so many fingers of the hidden hand were lopped off that the hand itself was badly crippled for many months to come. How the fingers grew and were again cut off, I hope to tell at some later date. Chapter 18. The Mysterious Cylinders. After over 2 years of strenuous work without a holiday, I found myself at length free, and I found myself one morning busy in my rooms in Curzon Street, making final arrangements for a trip to Worcestershire to spend a fortnight with Doris and her mother in their lovely country home. I was jaded and fagged, for I do not mind confessing that my work recently had considerably affected me, and I was looking forward with eager anticipation to the delights of a stay in the country. I had not seen Doris for some months, though of course we were in constant communication, and I was naturally longing for a sight of her. But I was destined to another disappointment. Just as I was finishing my packing, the telephone rang. I found the call was from Morgan, one of the ablest of the government experts on explosives, and he had a curious story to tell me. When I had listened to what he had to say, I realized with a heavy heart that my long-promised holiday must be again postponed. I rang up Doris on the telephone, and having broken the news to her, hurried off to Morgan's office. I found the expert in a state of utter bewilderment. He was an acknowledged authority on explosives, but a problem had been set before him which had baffled him completely. A few days previously, a mysterious explosion had occurred in some public gardens at Mile End. While a keeper was clearing away a pile of rubbish, he found a curious-looking metal cylinder lying in a flower bed, and while he was examining it, it exploded with a tremendous report, injuring the man so severely that he had to be taken, in a very critical condition, to the East End Hospital. A search by the police had a curious result. In other flower beds, a number of similar cylinders were found. They were very tiny, being only about 1.5 inches in length and about 1/4 inch in diameter. They contained a substance which was evidently the explosive. At one end, a piece of wire was attached, evidently as a means of exploding them, and at the other end was a strip of soft lead. Morgan showed me some of the cylinders and frankly confessed his ignorance of what they contained. "I thought I knew every explosive in existence," he told me, "but this is something entirely new. It must be tremendously powerful, judging by the size of the cylinders and the effect of the explosion on the unfortunate gardener who found the first one." As I held one of the small cylinders, studying it with great care, an idea came to me. "May I borrow this for a few days?" I asked. "I think I may be able to help you." "Certainly," replied Morgan, "but be careful. We don't even know how it is exploded." Next day I was in Paris and took train to Verneuil-les-Tons, some 30 miles from the capital, where I called on the manager of a certain well-known factory. When I showed him the little cylinder, he examined it with minute attention and carefully withdrew some of the mysterious explosive. This he placed under a microscope and a moment later said, "Monsieur is undoubtedly correct. It is some of our product, herbathite, the invention of our chief director, Mr. Herberth, and the most powerful explosive known to modern science. None has been used in actual work yet, and the only sample that has left our factory is that which was stolen. It is a great secret." "Has some been stolen, then?" I asked quickly. "Yes. Fortunately, we discovered the thief, a workman named Pasquet, and we thought we had recovered all that had been taken. Evidently, we were wrong, and some of the stuff has got into bad hands. Pasquet is awaiting trial by the Assize Court of the Seine." I returned to Paris and saw the Minister of Justice, to whom I made a certain proposal. Not without demur, he finally agreed, and I went to the prison armed with authority for a private interview with Pasquet. I met the thief in a small room in the governor's quarters of the prison. I found him to be a man of about 30, quite obviously of the hooligan type, and I soon guessed from his conversation that he had been in the first place the tool of others who, when they had made use of him, had abandoned him to his fate. He was naturally resentful and vindictive. I told him I had authority to offer him a free pardon and a reward which would give him a decent start in life if he would give us the fullest information in his power. He was suspicious, however, and it was not until my promise had been confirmed by the governor of the prison himself that he consented to speak. His promise once given, he made a clean breast of everything, and his information was so startling that I could hardly credit it. Possibly he saw my incredulity, for he said quietly, "Monsieur will find that I am telling the truth. Why should I lie? My whole life and liberty are in pawn for my veracity." I admitted that this was reasonable and promised to push things forward as quickly as possible. Something about the man had appealed to me, and I wondered whether, after all, he might not contain the makings of a decent citizen. My first concern was to send a wire to Madame Gabrielle, who was in Edinburgh, and the following evening she met me in my rooms in Curzon Street, where I unfolded the whole story to her. "Of course, we are not yet on firm ground," I pointed out to her. "Pasquet alleges that the real name of his friend Shackleton is von Schack, and that he is a Prussian engineer officer. Pasquet first met Shackleton in London, and later on Shackleton approached him at Verneuil with another man, whom he introduced as Norman, and they offered to buy some herbathite from him for 3,000 francs. Pasquet told me that he was very hard up owing to his wife's long illness. I have ascertained that this is quite true, and the temptation proved too much for him. It is only fair to him to remember that though he looks an abandoned ruffian, he bears a good character as a husband and father, and it seems to be the fact that the only money he spent out of that which he received from Shackleton and Norman went to purchase necessities and delicacies for his wife. The money really seems to have saved her life. Anyhow, He stole a quantity of the erbithite, which Shackleton and Norman packed in golden syrup tins and took to England. When Pasquet stole a second lot, he was discovered, and the dangerous stuff was found at his lodgings and recovered before he could hand it over to the two men who pretended to be English. One fact of importance at least is established, I added, namely, that Shack formerly carried on business as a watchmaker at Newcastle and sold his business to an Englishman a month before war broke out. For weeks we hunted in vain for Shackleton. I visited Newcastle and found that the man to whom he sold the business had later joined the army. This meant a journey to France for me, and I had an interview with the man at a certain brigade headquarters in the Somme battle area. Shackleton was undoubtedly a foreigner, and I should say probably a German, the watchmaker, now a corporal, told me. When he left, he asked me to forward any letters that might come for him and gave me the address. Care of Salisbury, High Street, Bristol. With that information, I went straight from the British front to the Great Severn Port. Here I found that Salisbury kept a newsagent's shop near Bristol Bridge, to which letters could be addressed. He did a big business in this way, for the address was very handy for seagoing men. Salisbury at first refused to give me the smallest information about his clients, but a sight of my authority opened his mouth, and as soon as he realized that something serious was on foot, he was only too willing to help me. "Of course, Mr. Sant," he said, "you will understand I have no knowledge whatever of the man. But I know that the Bristol Channel ports are full of spies, and it is very generally believed that few vessels leave here unknown to the German submarines lurking about the mouth of the channel. If I can help you at all, I shall be delighted." I then learned that Shackleton had called about a week before, taking away several letters addressed to him, and that he usually called at intervals of a week or 10 days. Salisbury promised to let me know at once, as soon as he came again, and I wired to the wily Aubert to come to Bristol and keep observation. Within 3 days, as I walked with my assistant along Victoria Street towards Temple Meads, he pointed out a middle-aged, keen-eyed, dark-haired man who had little of the appearance of a Teuton. He looked like a well-dressed, prosperous businessman, yet it was he who had induced the unfortunate Pasquet to steal the herbithite, and he was certainly engaged in some nefarious and deadly plot. For although the actual volume of the stolen explosive was not great, so tremendous was its power that the quantity in the hands of our foes was sufficient to wreak almost unimaginable havoc in half a dozen cities in England. Mr. Herbeth had looked very grave when he learned from Pasquet through me that the amount stolen was enough to fill 2 of the small cans used to hold golden syrup, about 1.5 pints altogether. "I hope monsieur will trace it in time," he said earnestly. "There is enough of it in their possession to destroy half London." We soon found out that Shackleton was living in furnished rooms at Clifton and had one close friend, who, after some difficulty, we proved to be his accomplice Norman. One morning, Aubert arrived at my hotel and reported that the pair had gone to the station and taken tickets for London. At once, I advised Madame Gabrielle by telephone to be on the platform at Paddington and watch them wherever they went. I myself took the next train to London and, driving to Curzon Street, awaited her report. But although I sat up until after 2 o'clock the next morning, she did not arrive, and I received no word from her. What contretemps had occurred? I was seriously uneasy, for I had impressed upon her the vitally important nature of our task, and if she failed or met with any mishap, we should be in a serious predicament, for we had no trace whatever of any of Shackleton's associations in London, and anything might happen before we could run him to earth again, among the teeming millions of the metropolis, the safest hiding place on earth. It was not until 6 o'clock the next evening that I received, by express messenger, a hastily scrawled note, in which Madame Gabrielle said, "Be extremely careful. They have discovered me, and I am being watched, so cannot come near you. Great things are in progress. Get someone to watch Shackleton, who is at the address below. Some great plot is in progress, that is certain. G." Without a moment's delay, I slipped round to Whitehall, and very soon an expert watcher was at the address given by Madame. 12 hours later, I was filled with dismay by a telephone message which told me that neither Shackleton nor Norman had been to the address given. They had both disappeared. Chapter 19. Spy's Letter Deciphered. Back in Curzon Street, completely at a loss, I flung myself into a big armchair and over a succession of pipes tried to piece our disconnected facts into a consecutive whole. Shackleton, or Shack, had moved from Newcastle to Bristol before the war, and I had little doubt that he had done so by express orders from the Königgrätzer. From this, I argued mentally that Bristol would almost certainly be the seat of his main activities, and that his early return thither might be looked for with some degree of confidence. Added to this, we knew from the frank declaration of a high port official that the Bristol Channel towns were swarming with spies, and I felt little doubt that they were acting under Shack's direction. On the whole, now that we had apparently lost the two men in London, Bristol seemed the most promising base for our operations. I decided therefore to return, and, leaving Madame at the Grosvenor in London, I took Aubert with me, together with an English secret agent whom I will call Moore. Moore took lodgings opposite Shackleton's house in Bristol, and at once opened an unwinking vigilance over the place. For a fortnight, however, there was no sign. In the meantime, 2 letters arrived, addressed to Shackleton, at Soulsby's. These were opened by the authorities, photographed, and, after being resealed, were delivered in the ordinary way. In one of the letters, which had been posted in London and purported to be an ordinary business transaction, was the statement, "We are having great difficulty with our clients, Johnson and Phillips, so we have placed the matter in the hands of our solicitors for advice." This letter ostensibly came from a firm of estate agents in the Harrow Road. I made an immediate inquiry and was not altogether surprised to learn that no such a firm existed. In the meantime, I studied the letter on the assumption that it contained a spy cipher, and after some hours' work succeeded in extracting from its apparently innocent contents the following startling message. Angarania will convey troops from Montreal on 30th Proximo. This set me at work with furious speed. An inquiry at the port offices showed me that the great liner was at the moment lying at Avonmouth, and that she would sail for Montreal a week later in order to bring over several thousand Canadian troops. Shackleton now made what was to me, I confess, a very welcome return to the scene. I had been seriously perturbed by the fear that we had lost him. While he was under my own immediate observation, I felt capable of checkmating his designs, but the knowledge that an able enemy agent was at large and uncontrolled, with enough herbathite in his possession to create an appalling disaster, worried me more than I can tell. Shackleton appeared on the scene the day after the delivery of the letter we had intercepted and photographed. Where he had been in the interval we never learned, but he did not arrive in Bristol from London, that was certain, for every train, day and night, was closely watched. Evidently the letter meant a good deal to him. He went at once to Avonmouth, closely followed by Moore. To our intense surprise, he seemed very well known at the docks and was freely admitted everywhere. He walked along the quays for some time, and we noted his obvious interest in the Angarania, now busily getting ready for her coming trip. We learned later that Shackleton had very cleverly wound himself into the confidence of a local shipping agent, and by this means had secured such frequent admission to the docks that his presence there was accepted almost as a matter of course. I now began to feel practically certain that the Angarania was the object of the conspirators, and that the herbathite was the means to be adopted to bring about her destruction. But how? Madame Gabrielle was to solve the question for us. The great liner was timed to leave at 6 o'clock, and an hour earlier the boat train had arrived from London, bringing an unusually large assembly of passengers. These included several government officials on their way to Canada, a number of highly placed military officers, and the members of 2 or 3 important war commissions. Some time after the arrival of the train, a shabbily dressed woman in a battered old hat pushed rudely against me. I turned, and to my amazement recognized Madame Gabrielle. She was obviously almost at the end of her strength, pallid with fatigue, and with deep circles round her eyes, which spoke eloquently of exhaustion. She made me a sign to follow her and slipped away from the crowd, which was hastening to the gangway. Directly we reached a quiet space, she gasped out, "Norman has booked cabin number 189 on the Angarania, in the name of Nash." I followed him to the shipping office and overheard. A moment later she fainted and fell heavily into my arms. I carried her at once to a waiting room and, handing her over without ceremony to the woman in charge, dashed at top speed for the quay where the Angarania was lying, now almost ready for departure. Not even for the sake of Madame Gabrielle would I venture a moment's delay. The last bells were ringing for the steamer's departure as I rushed onto the quay. As I neared the gangway, I saw, to my utter amazement, the man Norman stroll leisurely from the ship with the very last of the people who had been on board for the customary farewells. Evidently, he was not going by the vessel at all. A moment later, the gangways were withdrawn and the big liner moved away. Norman remained on the quay with the crowd, idly waving a real or pretended farewell to some supposed friend on the crowded decks. I have cursed myself for my stupidity many times since, and even now I shudder at the thought of how nearly the dastardly plot against the liner came to success. The vessel was well under way when the idea flashed into my mind. He has left the explosive on board. How I failed to divine this earlier, I cannot imagine. I suppose Norman's return from the ship threw me temporarily off my guard. But, in any case, there was not a second to be lost. The Angarania, heading down channel, was gathering speed every moment, bearing somewhere on board enough explosives to sink her in 10 seconds with the loss of hundreds of precious lives. Boldness was the only course possible. I called a couple of dock police and, showing them my authority, instructed them to arrest Norman at once. Before the spy could recover from his surprise, he was safely in custody and relieved of an extremely efficient automatic pistol. And now for the Angarania. I rushed to the competent military authority and briefly laid the facts before a veteran colonel in whom a life of splendid service to the Empire had bred a capacity for swift decision and prompt action. "She won't go far, Mr. Sant," he said cheerily as he picked up the telephone. A moment later, I caught the crackle of wireless and, to my relief, read the message. To QQ, the Angarania's code letters. Heave to immediately and await instructions. Port Commandant. A few minutes later, a clerk brought in the Angarania's acknowledgement. A quarter of an hour after I was aboard a British destroyer, which tore out into the channel and at 35 knots was flying along in the wake of the Angarania. We soon overhauled the big liner, and as we neared her could see the crowded passengers, evidently puzzled at the unexpected stoppage. As soon as I got on board, I accompanied the captain to his private cabin and told him the facts. Sending for the purser, he ordered him to bring on deck at once all the luggage which had come on board in the name of Nash. "And carry it carefully," he added, as he told the purser what it contained. By great good fortune, there was only one big trunk in the hold, and it was readily accessible. The rest of Nash's luggage was in his cabin. We soon had the lot on board the destroyer, where the torpedo officer rapidly overhauled it. In the big trunk, resting quite unconcealed on the top of a pile of clothes, were 2 tin canisters labelled golden syrup. I could not repress a shudder. "I think this is what we want," said the torpedo officer grimly, as he carefully picked up the dangerous canisters. And then he did a brave thing. "If you don't mind, sir," he said to the captain, "I will take them out in a boat and examine them myself." The captain nodded silently, and a few minutes later the ship's dinghy dropped over the side. The torpedo officer took his seat and rowed away alone, the canisters on the after thwart winking in the blazing sunshine. He was literally taking his life in his hands. We could not let the liner go until we were sure we had got what we wanted, and no one could be sure that the mere lifting of the canister lids would not explode the terrible compound they contained. Half a mile away from the ship, the rowing boat came to a stop. Through our glasses, we saw the torpedo officer deliberately pick up the canisters and without hesitation prise up the patent lids. A moment later, he waved to us and at once commenced to row back to the ship. "All right, let her go. I've got the stuff," he shouted as soon as he was within earshot, and a tremendous cheer went up from the crew, who in the mysterious wireless of the sea had learned what was afoot. A signal fluttered from the bridge of the destroyer. The Angarania dipped her pennant in acknowledgment, and soon the great liner was hurling herself through the sea on her interrupted journey. The rest of the story is soon told. The herbathite, we found, was covered with a thin layer of sweets, and at the customs examination of luggage, Nash had boldly lifted the lids and coolly showed the sweets to the officer. It was done so naturally as to defy any possible suspicion. But in the bottoms of the tins, we found two exquisitely made detonators, fashioned in the shape of watches and timed so as to explode the herbathite some 12 hours after the time fixed for the departure of the ship. These removed, the tins could be handled with comparative safety. We made a clean sweep of the conspirators. No details were ever given to the public, and the stoppage of the big liner was easily explained away to the passengers. We found out that the small cylinder picked up at Mile End had been intended for the purpose of blowing up a munitions train in an important tunnel outside London, but the conspirators found the approaches too closely guarded and gave up the project. They were all sent to Paris for trial on a charge of stealing herbathite and were eventually sentenced by court-martial to 15 years' imprisonment. Madame Gabrielle, I am glad to say, received a handsome reward from the British government, for our success was entirely due to her. She had followed Norman without food or rest or sleep for nearly 3 days and was in the last extremity of fatigue when she gave me her final and all-important message. Pasquet, I am glad to say, justified the impression I had formed of him, and I had the satisfaction of seeing him develop into a respectable member of society, happy in the society of his wife, now fully restored to health, and again enjoying the confidence of his employers. We were able, through him, to account for all the stolen herbathite, and it was a relief to know that none of the terrible compound remained in the hands of our enemies. Chapter 20. A message from the Herrengasse. I have here put into narrative form a number of astonishing facts taken from information read and testimony given at the court-martial subsequently held upon the guilty parties. The facts which I assisted in establishing will, I believe, be found of considerable interest to readers as further revealing the subtle methods of the enemy. For obvious reasons, I have been compelled to disguise certain names so as not to bring eternal dishonor upon a great and noble family. And if I revealed the truth to your dear, affectionate husband, whispered the soft-voiced, well-dressed Italian, what then, Eleanor? Madonna mia! No, cried the dark-haired, handsome young woman who sat at her tea-table in a great, elegantly furnished salon in one of those old 14th-century palazzi close to the port of Sarzana, the Italian naval station on the Adriatic. It was a bright afternoon in the summer of 1916. Sarzana, the old city in Ferrara, to which I had gone with Madame Gabrielle, a lazy, sun-blanched place, with its white houses and green sun-shutters, had of late been electrified into naval activity against those hated Tedeschi, those Austrians which every Italian had been taught to hate at his mother's knee. Things were going well with Italy. On that day, the Courier had published a long dispatch from General Cadorna, reporting a smashing defeat of the Austrians in the Alps and an advance in the direction of Trieste. The whole kingdom of Italy, from Ravenna to Reggio, was in a state of highest enthusiasm, and in Sarzana the excited populace were agog in the cafes and in the narrow, old-world streets. That most elegant 14th-century salon, with its faded tapestries and fine old portraits, in which the woman was seated with her visitor, was the same great room in which the Doge Francesco Bissolo, of Venice, assembled the famous Council of Ten, when they consulted with Malatesta after the Battle of Padua in 1405. The Bissolo Palace, the dark, almost prison-like walls, of which rose sheer from the canal within a stone's throw of the great naval dockyard, had little changed through 5 centuries. Its exterior was grim and forbidding, with windows barred with iron, its massive doors, which opened upon the narrow medieval street, heavily studded with nails and strengthened with iron. Within, however, while most of its antique charm had been preserved, it was the acme of luxury and taste, containing many priceless works of art, magnificent tapestries, and the famous collection of ancient arms belonging to its present owner, the Marchese Giulio Michelozzo Alfani, whose pretty young wife was that afternoon giving tea to a visitor. "No!" the woman exclaimed in a low, intense whisper. "No, Carlo, you would never do that. I know that once I treated you badly, and I was your enemy then. But that is long ago. Today I am your friend. Giulio must never know the truth. In his position as Admiral of the Port, it would mean ruin for him if the truth were revealed that I am an Austrian, and hence an enemy." "Yes, I agree that it would be very awkward for you, my dear Eleanor, if the truth ever leaked out," remarked the thin, sallow-faced, middle-aged man as he sipped the cup of tea in English fashion which she had handed him. About his lips was a strange hardness, even though his friendship was so apparent. "But you alone know, my dear Carlo, and you will never give me away. We were old friends in Budapest. Ah, I wish to forget those days, before I married Giulio," she remarked softly, with a bitter smile. "My dear Elena, don't think that I have called to threaten you," exclaimed Carlo Corradini, the well-dressed Italian, who lived such a gay existence in Rome, and who was so well known in the cosmopolitan life of the Corso and the Pincio. "Why should I? I am here, in Sarzana, upon a secret mission, in order to speak with you." "Why?" Well, as he paused, he looked the young wife of the Italian admiral full in the face. "Well, because, though your country is at war with Italy today, Austria has still friends in Italy, just as Germany has." "Ah, this war is all so horrible," declared the Marchesa, with a slight shudder. "You Italians hate every Austrian with a fierce and deadly hatred. Pardon me, my dear Eleanor, but you Austrians hate us just as fiercely," he laughed. "Where is Giulio?" "At his office. He will not be back until 7. He always goes to the club to take his vermouth there." Corradini glanced at the door to make certain it was closed. Then, bending across the little table with its splendid silver service, he whispered, "I have a secret message for you, from somebody you know." "A secret message? What?" asked the young Marchesa, opening her fine eyes widely. "From the Herrengasse, number 7. "From Vienna?" she asked in surprise, for the address he had given her was the bureau of the Austro-Hungarian Council of Ministers. He nodded mysteriously, and with a grin said, "From your old friend Schreier." She drew a long breath and went pale for a second. Mention of that name recalled to her a remembrance of the past, of the days when she was a dancer at the Raimund Theatre in Vienna, and when Count Schreier had, after a brief acquaintance, offered her his hand. But she had disliked him because he was such a cold, harsh bureaucrat, who had at that time occupied a high position at the Ministry of the Interior, and who possessed, as she once told a friend, a heart of granite. Eleanor's life story had been a rather curious one, but after all, not much out of the commonplace. The daughter of a poor Austrian musician in the orchestra at the Wiener Bürger Theatre in Vienna, and of an Italian mother, she had learned Italian from her birth, and on going to Italy to fulfill an engagement at the Politeama at Livorno, she had posed as an Italian, though hitherto she had lived all her life in Austria and had been taught to hate her dead mother's race. As an Italian, she had met, and afterwards married, the middle-aged Marchese Michelozzo Alfani, at that time a vice-admiral of the fleet. For 3 years prior to the war, her life had been quiet and uneventful. The summer she spent out at Antignano on the seashore, 3 miles from Livorno, or Leghorn as the English call it, where they rented a big white villa amid the vines and olives. In spring on the Lake of Garda, in autumn in Florence, and winter in Rome. From his early days, the Marchese had been a most popular naval officer, who had fought in Abyssinia and in Tripoli, and, being a favourite at the court of the Quirinale, promotion had come to him rapidly. Before his marriage, he had endeavoured to practice economy in order to redeem the fortunes of his ancient family. But now that his wife Eleanor proved so extravagant, he found himself getting deeper into debt each day. His appointment to Sarzana at the outbreak of the war had enabled him to return to the ancestral palace, which had passed from the Bisolo family to that of the Michelozzo in the 16th century, but which had for a good number of years been closed and in the hands of caretakers. His was one of the most important naval commands in Italy, and the Austrians were viewing that naval base with increased anxiety, it being so very close to both Trieste and Fiume. Admiral Michelozzo Alfani was one of the youngest of the officers of his grade in the Italian navy. Many raids he had made upon Austrian ports on the Adriatic, and Ragusa, Zara, Sebenico, and other places had suffered severe bombardment by his Mosquito fleet. Therefore, at the Admiralty in Vienna, his great activity was being frequently discussed. "I see, my dear Eleanor, you have not forgotten your friend the Count," laughed the sallow-faced Italian across the table presently. "Neither has he forgotten you." "How do you know?" "Well, because he spoke to me about you only 3 weeks ago." "3 weeks ago?" echoed the Marchesa. "How could you have met?" Carlo Corradini grinned very mysteriously. "Well, I was in Vienna 3 weeks ago. That is all." "You in Vienna?" she gasped. "Are you then a friend of my country?" she asked, in a low, hoarse whisper. "Why, of course," he replied. "You are Austrian in all but name. I am a born Italian, but, well, I am a friend of Austria." "A well-paid friend, eh?" "Yes, just as you may be, if you will. The Count is still your friend, and he greatly admires you. It is his one regret that you preferred the Marchese Giglio. He is a good fellow, is the Count. He is now prime favourite with the Emperor, and he still remains unmarried. Elena, he thinks always of you, and only you." The handsome Elena shrugged her shoulders. The man who had called upon her quite unexpectedly she had first met 5 years ago in Budapest. He was then a poor Italian composer of music. Yet now, in mysterious circumstances, he was, she knew, in possession of ample funds, and lived in an elegant flat close to the Piazza Colonna in Rome. They exchanged glances, whereupon he settled himself to speak more openly to her, and to give her a verbal message from her old admirer at the Herrengasse. Carlo Corradini began by laughing at her patriotic devotion to her husband's country. "Of course, Giglio is a most excellent fellow," he said. "But alas, he is merely fighting a lost cause. The Central Powers are bound to win, and it is now for you to assist your own country. Schreier appeals to you. He knows of your difficulty in meeting that last loan which old Levitsky, the Jew in Milan, made to you a year ago, and—" "How does he know that?" she inquired, in quick surprise. "My dear Eleanor, how does Austria know so many secrets of her enemies?" He laughed. "Schreier is now head of that department of the Secret Service which deals with affairs here in Italy, and you, an Italian, are one of his agents," she interrupted, in a low, meaning voice. He bowed in the affirmative in silence. Then, after a few moments, he remarked in a strange, meaning tone, his black, penetrating eyes fixed upon her, "I know the secret of your nationality and your friendship with Count Schreier, and you know mine. So, my dear Eleanor, we have nothing to fear from each other. Do you understand?" "I don't understand. You surely are not hinting that I should betray my husband's secrets, the naval secrets of Italy?" The dark, smooth-tongued man from Rome smiled quietly as he answered, "That, my dear Eleanor, is exactly the message I bear to you from Schreier. It is known that your husband tells you a good deal. You have whispered secrets to your friends, the Comtesse Landrini, and also the Renata Pozzi. If to them, then why not to me, eh?" "Never," she cried. "I have married an Italian, and I am now Italian. But the money, it will be useful. Levitsky must be paid in full in 8 weeks' time. 72,000 lire. That is the sum, I think. If you fail him this time, he will take his revenge and tell the truth. He does not know, but Schreier will tell him." "What?" she gasped, starting from her chair. "Has the Count told you that?" "Well, he has not exactly said so in words," was her visitor's reply. He only hinted at it and sent me straight to see you. I had to travel by way of Holland and London, quite a long journey. Then you shall tell him that I refuse, she answered. I will never betray Italy, and more especially through Giglio, who believes in my patriotism and never dreams that I am anything but an Italian born and bred. That makes it all the easier. He will never suspect you, remarked the sallow-faced man with a sinister smile upon his lips. I tell you, she cried angrily, I decline to enter into it at all. The door suddenly opened as she spoke, and there entered the Admiral, a smart, good-looking, middle-aged man in uniform with decorations, whose appearance was so unexpected that they both started. "Decline what, my dear?" he asked sharply. "What is the matter?" "Oh, nothing, Giglio," she laughed lightly. "You recollect Signor Corradini, who used to come to see us in Livorno?" "Why, of course," said the Admiral, as the two men bowed to each other. A lie rose readily to her lips, and she said, "Well, Signor Corradini has called in order to try and induce me to take part in the Princess di Pagliano's tableau vivant at Bologna in aid of the Croce Rosso. But I am far too busy with hospital work here in Sarzana, so I have declined." "Yes, dearest, you are far too busy. I am always afraid Elena will overwork herself, my dear Corradini. I am nervous lest she should have a breakdown." The woman and her tempter exchanged meaning glances. Everyone knows how intensely patriotic is the Marchesa, and we all admire her for her hard work in the cause of charity. My friend the princess, however, asked me to call here and solicit her help, and in consequence I have done so. The Admiral thanked him warmly, for the Princess di Pagliano's exertions in war work were well known throughout Italy. Elena's husband sipped the tea she handed him, and, after chatting with their visitor for a further half-hour, the Admiral suddenly asked, "What are you doing down in Rome nowadays?" "Oh, of course, we are all working hard. I am secretary in a department in the Ministry of War, the department which is in touch with France and England concerning munitions." He spoke the truth. Carlo Corradini held a very important position in the ministry, even though, as we afterwards discovered, he had in secret long been an enemy agent. This latter fact, Giglio Michelozzo Alfani never dreamed. Like all others, he never imagined that Carlo, hating the Tedeschi so fiercely as he did, could be in secret their ingenious and unscrupulous friend. The Marchese himself was a true-born Italian, one of the ancient aristocracy of the north. Those who know Italy know quite well the stern and honest patriotism of her sons from Count to Contadino, and of the fierce, relentless hatred of every Austrian. Presently the well-dressed civilian functionary rose, clicked his heels, and in the elegant Italian manner raised his hostess's hand, and, kissing it, wished her addio. The dark eyes of the Admiral's young wife met his in that second, and they understood. 5 minutes later, Carlo Corradini was hurrying along the Via Vittorio Emanuele, the principal street in Sarzana, in the grey evening light. Then, turning to the left, he gained the Passeggio, which faced the Adriatic, that long promenade lined with its dusty, wind-swept tamarisks, where by day the cicale, harbinger of heat, chirped their monotonous chant. Corradini's visit to Sarzana proved to be a protracted one. His excuse was that he had been sent from the ministry upon a special mission, and, in consequence, he had preferred to rent a little flat on the Passeggio than to live in the Albergo Stella d'Italia. One day, at 6 o'clock, he met, at a very obscure restaurant called the Vapore, a certain Countess Malipiero, a middle-aged, ugly, but quite wealthy woman who lived near the Santa Maria della Salute and who was a great personal friend of the Marchesa. The pair dined together at the popular little establishment, eating a simple dish of paste al pomidoro, for which the trattoria was noted, a costoletta and a piece of stracchino to follow. But over that simple meal the pair remained in serious consultation, while not far from them sat the good-looking but unobtrusive Madame Gabrielle Soyer, for the pair were already under suspicion, though we had as yet no reliable evidence to justify interference. Afterwards the pair walked together as far as the Piazza Grande, and there parted, the spy of Austria smiling as he went along the noisy street towards the sea. Chapter 21. The Admiral's Secret. 3 weeks passed. Old Sarzana has ever been a city of black conspiracy and clever intrigue. In those glorious days of the Venetian Republic, persons of both sexes who were antagonistic or in any way obstacles to the carrying out of the secret plans of the Council of Ten were, by accident, secretly poisoned or openly assassinated, as is shown in the many reports which even today repose in the secret archives of the Palace of the Doges at Venice. As medieval Sarzana was a veritable hotbed of intrigue in those days when Venice ruled the Adriatic, so were desperate plots afoot in the yesterday of Cadorna's triumphant advance into Austria. Enemy plots and counterplots were hatched in those darkened houses upon the silent waterways, or by the open sea. One of them I now reveal for the first time. Truth to tell, the Marchesa Elena had been forced by the elegant, insidious Corradini to accept traitorous service in the pay of Austria. Their usual meeting place was in the old church of St. Antonio, which at Vespers was always crowded by the devout, who, in the days of war, prayed for Italy's victory. Sarzana had always been one of the most pious cities in Italy, and each evening the splendid old cathedral was crowded. And in that crowd the pair met, kneeling side by side to whisper, and again, near them, knelt Madame Gabrielle. In all Sarzana, no woman worked harder at the great war hospital established in the communal palace than the popular wife of the Admiral of the Port. The Marchese, the most influential and delightful man in Sarzana, was, as everyone knew, the author of the many raids upon the enemy which had from time to time been carried out. Well known, too, it was how the Mosquito fleet of destroyers, piloted by him, had only a month ago entered the great harbour of Cattaro, opposite Rimini, and had sunk 4 big Austrian battleships at anchor there, 4 of the biggest ships of Austria's navy. About this time, the wealthy Countess Malipiero, who was nowadays Eleanor's most intimate friend, and who was constantly at the Admiral's table, purchased a big sea-going motor launch, a quiet, harmless old fisherman called Beppo, well known in Sarzana, being placed as skipper. Before the war, the Countess had, in secret, been in very poor circumstances, but owing to the death of a relative, so she explained, she had been left a substantial legacy. One evening, as the Admiral and his wife were about to finish dinner tête-à-tête, the manservant announced that Captain Vivarini, the second in command, had called and desired to speak with his chief very urgently. "Show the captain to the study," said the Marchese, as he rose at once and passed along to his cosy little den, which overlooked the port. Elena, instantly upon the alert, and suspecting that something unusual had happened, waited until the captain had been conducted to her husband's room, and then she crept silently along to the door, where she knew she could overhear the conversation, having listened there several times before. On tiptoe she approached noiselessly over the soft Turkey carpet, and placing her ear to the door, was enabled to hear news. In brief, it was to the effect that one of the newest Austrian submarines had been captured intact, with officers and crew, off the point of Cortellazzo. The submarine number 117 left Fiume only yesterday, according to its commander, whom I have interrogated, the captain reported. "Benissimo!" exclaimed the Admiral, much gratified. "Then the enemy will not yet know of its capture. In the meantime, we must act. The submarine belongs to Fiume, therefore, my dear Vivarini, she must return to Fiume." "Go back?" echoed the captain. "Yes, she must sail again tonight with an Italian crew," said the Admiral. "She will enter Fiume harbour flying her own flag, but at the same time she will discharge torpedoes at as many of the vessels of war lying there as she can. You understand?" "Santa Virgin, what a plan!" exclaimed the captain enthusiastically. "Most excellent, Signor Marchese." "All must be done in strictest secrecy," said the other, lowering his voice. "Not a single word must leak out, for there can be no doubt that there are spies here in Sarzana. News of our intentions gets across the Adriatic in an astounding manner sometimes. Not a syllable must be known, either regarding our capture or our intentions. Number 117 must return tonight." "Not a whisper," the captain agreed, whereupon the Marchesa, a tall, slim figure in a dinner gown of carnation pink and wearing a velvet bow of the same shade in her hair, slipped back again to the salon, where she awaited her husband, pretending to read. "Well, Captain Vivarini," she exclaimed, greeting their visitor merrily as the two men entered. "Some new development, I suppose, eh?" "Yes, Marchesa," replied the handsome naval captain, bowing low over her hand with that peculiar Italian courtesy. "A little confidential matter," and he laughed. Then, after a cigarette and a tiny glass of green Certosa, the admiral and the chief of his staff left. As soon as they had gone, Elena rushed to her room, slipped off her dining gown, and putting on a tweed skirt and blouse, hurried from the house. She slipped along the dark, narrow side street until suddenly she emerged onto the moonlit promenade and ascended the dimly lit stone stairs which led to the room occupied by Carlo Corradini. In response to her ring, the spy of Austria at once admitted her. "Why, Elena, this is a surprise. What has happened?" he asked eagerly. The admiral's wife passed into the little sitting room and, without seating herself, revealed hastily what was intended, adding, "I must return home at once, or Giglio may wonder where I am." "What a plot!" exclaimed the dark-haired traitor. "It does the greatest credit to your husband's ingenuity." Then, suddenly reflecting, he said in a strange, hard voice, "If I act successfully, your husband himself may be charged with giving away secrets to the enemy. If so, because you love him, you might denounce me, Elena." After a second's pause, he added, "I trust no one, not even you. My life is at stake in this affair. Therefore, you will swear that, whatever happens, and even if suspicion be cast upon your husband, you will never betray me." "Of course, Carlo. Am I not Austrian? I swear it." The spy took from a table a book covered with shiny black leather and pressed it very firmly into her hand. It was a copy of the New Testament. "Kiss it and swear," he said. In obedience, she acted as he wished, repeating a solemn oath after him. "I trust you, Elena," he said fervently, at the same time gallantly kissing the back of the white, slim hand which had held the book. "And I trust you, Carlo," she whispered. "Trust in me. No suspicion must rest upon anybody. I leave that to your own clever ingenuity." A few moments later, she descended the steep stone stairs to hurry home as quickly as she could. Arriving at the great palazzo, she at once resumed her smart dinner gown and, entering the salon half an hour afterwards, sat down to await her husband's return. Ere she had done this, however, the motor launch of the Countess Malipiero, driven by old Beppo, sped out from the harbour on pretence of taking an invitation to one of the lieutenants on board the battleship Italia, which was lying just within the mole. He slowed up alongside one of the guardships by the boom, and as he did so, the great eye of a searchlight was turned full upon him. Then, at once recognized by the watchman on duty, he was allowed to pass out to sea. Being such a familiar figure, no suspicion had ever been cast upon the stern, patriotic old fellow. Sometimes his boat was stopped and examined, but, as he never had anything aboard, it had become a habit with the guardships to allow him to pass unchallenged. When about a mile from the boom, the old fellow drew a map from his pocket and, having examined it very carefully by the light of a flash lamp, consulted his compass. Then, altering his course, he sped along for nearly 2 hours in the darkening night, when at last he placed 2 green lights, one at port and one at bow. He had started at 10, but it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when he began to grow anxious and consult his watch. Presently he saw the slight tremor of a searchlight, and fearing detection by some Italian ship, he at once extinguished all his lights, and pulling up, waited for nearly half an hour. It was a dark, lonely vigil, but with the aid of another cigar, the crafty old seafarer passed the time until he again ventured to relight his green lamps. Scarcely had he done this when, about half a mile away, he saw a tiny light winking in the Morse code. He read the familiar signal, and cutting off his engine, waited until of a sudden the low hull of a submarine came up in the darkness quite close to him. Then, adroitly manoeuvring his launch, both the vessel and boat rising and falling in the heavy swell, he drew nearer. "Is that Beppo?" shouted a voice in Italian from the submarine. "Yes," shouted the old man. "I have something for you." He took from his pocket a small leather bag purse, such as men carry, one of those drawn through a ring, tied it upon a tight line, and standing up, he flung it with a seaman's precision over the conning tower of the submarine. "All right," shouted the Austrian officer, for such he was. "Wait a moment till I've read what you have brought." For a few moments he disappeared into the body of the vessel, while Beppo hauled in his wet line. Then, when the officer reappeared, he shouted, "All right, Beppo. No answer. Buona notte e buon viaggio." That same evening a secret council had been held, presided over by the admiral, when all the details were arranged. The officers and crew of the Austrian submarine number 117 were safely under lock and key, and after the council, just before 11 o'clock, the admiral himself visited the captured undersea boat and inspected it. Commander Bellini, one of Italy's most distinguished submarine officers, had been chosen, together with a picked crew, to attempt the raid, but none were informed, for the Marchese was determined this time to keep the secret of his plans. Just before midnight, a submarine, heavily awash, for the sea was rough, slipped away out of the harbor of Sarzana, winked a farewell message, and then, submerging so as not to be seen by other ships, was lost to view. She was the raider, the intention of whose commander was to blow up or damage seriously at least half a dozen of the enemy's ships lying off fume on the other shore of the Adriatic. The Italian crew consisted of a picked lot of fine, patriotic fellows who only now knew their desperate mission, and they knew also what their fate must be, either death or capture, when the truth became revealed. After traveling swiftly all night, the periscope revealed at dawn the long, broken Austrian coast. Then, when within 5 miles of the entrance to the deep bay of Queux, at the end of which is situated Austria's important harbour, the vessel emerged and ran up her Austrian colours. Before her, high upon the green point of Monte Grosso, which guards the entrance to the bay, a signal was made, to which number 117 replied, and then, with her grey hull showing above the surface, she sped unsuspiciously up the channel, past the small wooded islands and the pretty town of Abasia into the harbour, where lay fully a dozen war vessels, including 3 of the enemy's biggest battleships. Suddenly, however, just as she was about to discharge a torpedo at a battleship flying the admiral's flag, the thunder of guns rang out from all sides, and number 117 became the target for concentrated fire from all the forts. As the shells hit her, she flew to pieces. Next second, she was seen to be rapidly sinking with all on board, not a soul being able to escape from that rain of death. The submarine had been entrapped, and the raid had ignominiously failed. News of the disaster reached Admiral Michelozzo Alfani through the Naval Intelligence Department in the afternoon, and he sat in his room astounded. So well kept had been his secret that he felt absolutely positive that outside those officers who formed his council, nobody had any knowledge of his intention. All of those officers were men above suspicion. That there was a traitor somewhere, he was more fully convinced than ever. Other minor secrets had been known to the enemy mysteriously from time to time, yet he had been utterly unable to trace the source of the leakage. Alone in his office at the port, he sat at his table, his brow resting upon his hands. At noon, unknown to him, his wife had telephoned to the Countess Malipiero, but was informed by the latter's maid that she had left hurriedly for Rome on the previous night, after a visit from her friend, Signor Corradini. Throughout the afternoon she expected Carlo to call upon her, and became extremely anxious when he did not put in an appearance. At last, unable to stand the strain longer, she sent her little sewing-maid round to Corradini's flat, but the girl returned with the letter to say that, according to the Donna di Casa, the signor had left Sarzana hurriedly at 10 o'clock the previous night. The hours seemed like years as the guilty woman sat alone in her magnificent old-world salon, pale, startled, and nervous. Upon her left hand she wore a white glove. She had worn it ever since the previous evening, and the reason had greatly perturbed her. At last, at nearly 10 o'clock that night, her husband returned, hard-faced and haggard. With him was his chief of staff, Captain Vivarini, Madame Gabrielle, and myself. The instant we entered the room, she saw that Giglio was not his old self. "Elena," he said abruptly, in a deep, hard voice, "I have something to say to you, and I have brought Vivarini here as witness." "As witness?" she echoed, starting to her feet. "Of what?" "As witness that you are innocent of the charge made against you, that you, though my wife, are a spy of Austria." "A spy?" she laughed uneasily, in pretence of ridicule. "Have you really taken leave of your senses, Giglio?" "I have not." "Tell me," he demanded, "why are you wearing that glove?" I saw that she held her breath. Her face was instantly blanched to the lips. "Because last night I scratched my hand," she replied. "Please remove it and allow me to see the scratch." "I refuse," she cried angrily. Next instant, at a sign from the Marchese, Vivarini and I seized her hand when her husband, roughly tearing off the white kid glove, examined her palm. He stood aghast. "Dio!" gasped the horrified man. "The brand is here. You, Elena, my wife, you are the spy." "Giglio!" shrieked the unhappy woman, flinging herself frantically upon her knees before him. "Forgive me. Santa Madonna! Forgive me." "I may forgive you, Elena," replied the Admiral, in a low, stern voice, "but Italy will never forgive." Then, turning abruptly, he left the room, the captain following. But as he passed out, 2 agents of the Italian secret police passed in, and a few seconds later the wretched woman found herself under arrest. It was not until her trial by court-martial in Milan 2 weeks later that the Marchesa learned, from the evidence given by Madame Gabrielle and myself, the truth of Carlo Corradini's terrible vengeance, a long-nurtured grievance that he had held against her ever since those days in Budapest, when, on proposing to her, she had laughed him to scorn and had actually told people of his poverty. He had sworn to be avenged, and truly his vengeance had been both ingenious and complete. On the evening when she had brought to his room the information regarding the captured submarine, he had handed her the testament upon which to take her oath of secrecy. Upon the shiny black leather cover of that book he had traced with a solution of nitrate of silver mixed with other chemicals a geometrical design, a square divided in half, the lower part being left blank, and in the upper portion a V, above it being traced a small circle. When he had placed the book into her palm, it had left an indelible imprint upon her skin, a device which did not show itself until an hour later, when, very naturally, it greatly mystified her. Carlo Corradini had thus branded the woman he hated, and then, the coup having been made at Fiume, he had at once written an anonymous letter to Armand Heck, head of the International Intelligence Bureau, denouncing the Admiral's wife as an Austrian who had divulged Italy's secret. In support of his allegation, he urged us to search the rooms of Carlo Corradini, where we should not only find evidence of espionage, but also the actual testament by which the hand of the Marchesa had been branded. Further, that 80,000 lire would be found in her possession, that being the price which Corradini had paid for the information concerning submarine number 117. The trial, held in camera, opened at 11 o'clock, and just before 3 sentence of death was pronounced. An hour later, I was present when a firing party was drawn up in the yard of the great San Giovanni prison. Her eyes were bandaged, and the capital sentence was carried out. Truly, Carlo Corradini was a scoundrel of the worst type, and his revenge was, indeed, a dastardly one. Fortunately, however, it reflected upon himself, for 4 months later, he and his companion, the Countess, were captured, living in obscurity in a small coast village near Bari, in the extreme south of Italy, where they were hoping to escape to Greece. Corradini's own anonymous letter proved the most direct evidence against him, and ultimately both paid the same penalty as their victim in the yard of the prison of San Giovanni at Milan.